Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
In the middle of an ever-escalating overdose crisis, drug policy in Canada is at an inflection point. Even as programs like Safe Supply or consumption sites face cancellation or rollbacks from governments, the drugs on the street get worse. Less safe, more potent, more likely to kill users who overdose alone. Now, in this climate, if you are someone who believes in harm reduction and you see it under attack, if you're seeing people die, and you know that at the root of it, so much of this is caused by the quality of the drugs on the street, then you might be tempted to intervene in what would seem, logically, to be the easiest place to start. Just go get good drugs and give them directly to the people who use them. Now that would, of course, create all sorts of problems. It is a DIY approach to the overdose crisis that could easily land you in jail. But if it saves lives, decided the people at the center of our story today, shouldn't you do it anyway? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Omar Mualim is a filmmaker and a contributing editor at Maclean's, where he wrote about a truly unique aspect of the safe supply issue and the overdose crisis. Hello, Omar.
Hello. Thanks for having me on the show.
We're always pleased to have you on the show, and this is a really fascinating story. And I wonder maybe if before we get into the specifics of what you wrote about, you could maybe just sum up the current debate around safe supply and what it really is, because this has become incredibly politicized over the last year or so.
Yeah. So safe supply is really a alternative to an illicit drug that gives the euphoric effects, but is not as toxic or not as dangerous. And so therefore it provides people a little bit of stability in their lives. So instead of trying to get their next fix, they have a reliable source in usually a medical or clinical environment that keeps them connected to the healthcare system. And I think when it comes to safe supply, probably the earliest version of what we think of it as now would probably be heroin-assisted treatment, which started in Switzerland in the 90s and has expanded to some other European countries. There's only been one trial for it in Canada. So people who are addicted to heroin are at high risk of overdose or diseases that are related to intravenous drug use would be able to receive a consistent and pure supply of it as part of their recovery treatment. So safe supply in Canada, we only started to see it within the last 8 years or so, but basically it is a pharmaceutical alternative to highly addictive drugs. So if someone is addicted to heroin or fentanyl, they might get a prescription of very powerful opioids like Dilaudid, or if they are addicted to something like methamphetamines, they might get a prescription of Adderall.
I guess there are a ton of different approaches to safe supply. And as you mentioned, prescription pharmaceuticals are a big part of that. But what you wrote about are a couple of people who moved in a different direction. So maybe just tell us, who are Eris and Jeremy Calicum? What are their backgrounds?
So Eris and Jeremy Calicum are the founders of the Drug User Liberation Front in Vancouver, also known as DULF. And they are advocates of what they see as true safe supply. So in these pharmaceutical models, you're not really giving drug users the drugs they want. You're giving them some sort of alternative, a less powerful alternative.
Right.
And so, it gets mixed results because of that. But I think more importantly, understanding that people are going to use the drugs that they want and they get them from the streets, and the supply on the streets is so toxic. The Drug User Liberation Front had this idea of getting heroin, meth, cocaine of pure and consistent potencies and distributing that to people who are at high risk. And really, as their philosophy goes, these uncontaminated versions of illicit drugs should be available to anyone who uses drugs, not just those who might have a substance use disorder.
So how do they do that? Where do they go to get reliably safe drugs that are illegal?
Well, that's the thing. So there's no legal pharmaceutical supply of these drugs that they can access. So what they ended up doing was going to the dark web, which is, sort of this encrypted, more anonymous version of the internet that really any of us could access. But, most people don't unless they are trying to do something that is above the law.
A little sketchy.
Yeah, I mean, it is undoubtedly sketchy. But here's the interesting thing. When it comes to procuring illicit drugs, it is maybe less sketchy, you could argue. And here's the reason. So this idea came from Jeremy Calicum, who is a pretty fascinating person. He's maybe not who you would expect to be involved in sort of a radical drug reform grassroots group like this. He's actually an aspiring doctor and is a researcher as well in this space. And he had heard that drugs procured on the dark web tend to be purer and have more consistent potencies. And the reason for that is because the way that drugs are sold on the dark web is not all that different from, say, buying something from eBay or Amazon, in that you can find reviews on them. And if you order something and it's not up to standard, you're sold a false bill of goods, you can actually get a refund for it. And so that kind of accountability, it's believed, is what has made the dark net's supply of drugs to be pure and, in a sense, I guess, safer compared to the fentanyl or carfentanil or benzodope tainted drugs that have really filled the supply of illicit drugs on the streets.
So they purchase these drugs from the dark web, and that gives them the benefit of being more pure and hopefully safer. What do they do to get them to users? Like, what's the process here?
They then test it, and they test it again using free drug checking sites at universities, UBC, University of Victoria. And then they package these drugs. And the sophistication of the packaging, I mean, it looked like something you might buy at a cannabis store. The transparency on these labels that told you exactly what the contents were and at what percentage, in some ways they exceeded the labeling on alcohol purchases. And they started first by staging these sort of public stunts, these protests where they would give away drugs on the downtown east side of Vancouver, and then there would be a march. And they did this, a few times, and incredibly, they got away with it. Like, there were no arrests. At some of these events, police were present, but for traffic control. And so it looked like maybe they had a lot of public support behind this model of safe supply. And certainly they were gaining a lot of support from some very legitimate nonprofits, as well as institutions like the BC Centre of Substance Use. And eventually they got buy-in from city councillors and city council itself in order to propose to Health Canada a model for a compassion club. Now, compassion clubs were quite popular in the 80s, 90s with cannabis, when cannabis was illegal. Compassion clubs were set up mostly for AIDS patients who couldn't access this for treatment. They're taking this idea of compassion clubs in order to confront the overdose crisis, which I think at last count has killed 46,000 Canadians in the last about 9 years. And there have been public health emergencies declared all over the country, starting in BC in 2015, in fact. And so what if they were to open a compassion club? What if members could access this? They could buy these drugs at cost. They would be tested. They would have an overdose prevention site where they could use it. They would be able to also use this for research to study the effects of a safe supply compassion club. And so that's what they proposed to Health Canada. They had the support of city council. They had the support of a pharmaceutical company that was willing to provide pharmaceutical grade or medical grade heroin. And they had the support of Vancouver Coastal Health, the local health authority,
Wow.
which not only gave them $200,000 to operate, but actually provided them a space, a former OPS site, in order to have this compassion club. They did not get the Section 56 exemption from Canada Health in order to sort of operate this with criminal immunity. This is the same exemption that allowed for supervised consumption sites originally on the downtown east side and that we now see all over the country.
Right.
However, they did see that they had a lot of public support, institutional support, so they went ahead with it anyway. And they did this in August of 2022. And they went a full year growing their membership from 20 to about 50. They had initially selected their members through a lottery. As you can imagine, somewhere on the downtown east side, there are a lot of people who think they might benefit from this and who would want to access it. But of course, it was quite exclusive. They had to have a lottery. The membership grew to about 50. And during that time, they also ran a study with the BCCSU and Dr. Thomas Kerr, who's one of the leading researchers in addictions and harm reduction in Canada. People would come to this, undisclosed location, though it was not the best kept secret. I mean, anyone who was in the know would know where it was. And once they get there, there was sort of a double gate. So they would have to buzz to get in. They would have to provide their membership number. They would be allowed in. They were allowed to buy up to 14 grams of any of the 3 drugs that they sold. Interestingly, they did not sell fentanyl. They felt that fentanyl was probably too dangerous and potent to allow their members to administer on their own. So they stuck with heroin there, which for some opioid users who are now extremely addicted to fentanyl, heroin was not strong enough. So, it's not that these drugs were necessarily meant to keep people entirely from buying from the streets. I don't think they even really had the inventory to do that. But like heroin-assisted treatment or methadone, it was a way of giving them a little bit more stability. Maybe they will interact with the illicit market less. They might be able to, with that stability, find some housing or find job. So they did this study, and the research was recently published, and the results looked very positive.
I want to ask a question that I think a lot of people have when we talk about safe supply, which is safe the right term? Are there really safe versions of things like heroin and fentanyl and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? And even this term itself, like so many terms in the addictions and recovery treatment world, they can be loaded, charged. You can often tell where people are ideologically by the terms that they use. Some people prefer safer supply. You will often hear people in government will prefer this term because it alludes to the sense that drugs are inherently toxic. And therefore, there is no such thing as a safe supply. It can only be safer. The BC government has, because of the diminishing popularity of safe supply programs, they've moved entirely to the original term, which is pharmaceutical alternatives.
A businessman's way to say it.
Yeah, exactly, right?
So what did the study say about the Compassion Club and what kind of outcomes it led to? And then I guess we'll have to talk about how this whole thing came crashing down.
Yeah, well, it's related to the results in some ways. So over those 12 months, they found that DOLF members reported significantly fewer overdoses and hospitalizations, as well as police interactions and instances of drug-related violence. So none of their members had died. Interestingly, one person who had applied to become a member had died in between applying and the Compassion Club opening. They had died of an overdose. None had overdose using DOLF's drug supply at the DOLF Center. I don't believe they have the data to say whether anyone had overdosed on their supply outside of it, but while they were there, they were able to be monitored and there were no reports of overdoses there. And so when they had these preliminary results in about August, September of 2023, Dolph was ready to go public. They thought that this was going to be the thing that gained them finally the federal support that was missing, that missing piece in order to get the exemption from Health Canada.
Right.
But it actually backfired.
How so?
Well, the coverage that they got in the media kind of stoked this political outrage machine that had been, brewing for quite a while, but in the few years when Dolph launched and got all this public support, and in the time when they came forward with these preliminary results, the political winds had changed quite a bit. And I'm sure many people listening to this have noticed it themselves. I mean, you see how in Alberta, supervised consumption sites, which had just started to open in 2017, are now starting to close. And there's a lot of pressure on OPSs across the country to close or move or preventing them from being opened. And then the safe supply debate has become particularly sensitive and straight up toxic. I mean, there was a viral video, independent documentary that came out in 2022, 2023 called Vancouver is Dying. 4 million people have watched it. And this documentary portrayed Vancouver as this bleak landscape of urban decay and lawlessness because of permissive drug policies like safe supply. And that was followed by another viral video from Pierre Poilievre called Everything Feels Broken, in which he called out the failed experiment of safe supply at the government level, blamed it for the reason that Vancouver has such a extraordinary, staggering overdose rate and addictions rate.
So the report comes out and the Compassion Club has some pretty compelling data to present. But at the same time, obviously, the winds are shifting against safe or safer supply. So what happens to the club? And more importantly, or just as importantly, what happens to Eris and Jeremy?
Yeah, so it happened really fast. I mean, within weeks of Dolph starting their PR effort that was, trying to publicize its positive research, they ended up drawing attention to their illegal model, which had been tacitly tolerated. I mean, politicians have pretended that they were hearing about it for the first time, but it's just absolutely impossible.
Right.
They received international attention from, The Economist, Time magazine. They were on TV multiple times in that year. But anyhow, it began with a tweet, as many things do. An MLA, Eleanor Sturko of the BC United Party, a centrist sort of right-of-center party that, came out of the ashes of the BC Liberal Party. She started bringing attention to this and tweeting at BC's NDP Premier, at the Solicitor General, asking questions like, isn't drug trafficking illegal? Saying things like, through Dolph, the NDP are funding the drug dealers. And the reason that she was making that argument is because of the Vancouver Coastal Health funding. This put a lot of pressure on the NDP. And, they're not far from a provincial election. And the NDP can clearly see that, the favorability of harm reduction in Canada is starting to shift a little bit more to the center, a little bit more rightward. And so they clamp down on Dolph. During this period of immense pressure, Vancouver Coastal Health was totally silent. City Council, totally silent. These allies, presumed allies who had written letters of support to Health Canada for Dolph to open a Compassion Club were nowhere to be seen. And, the arrest came.
Right.
The Vancouver Police Department raided the Compassion Club. They arrested Nix and Calicum at gunpoint. And, there's even a story of when they raided their homes, they seized Jeremy Calicum's grandmother's ashes.
Wow.
And the damage to his property resulted in him being evicted. So the effects on them were quite devastating. What's interesting, though, is that, after the arrest in October of 2023, the charges were pending for quite a while. In fact, the charges finally just came in on May 31st, 3 counts of drug trafficking for each of them. The reason for that, it's believed, is because Dolph is actually still entangled in another legal challenge with Health Canada. They have been challenging the rejection of their exemption application. And it was believed that the government was going to wait for the results of that to come forth. Evidently, they did not. However, that legal challenge is definitely something to watch because they had their judicial review back in March of this year. I attended it. I think to many people's surprise, Health Canada seemed perhaps unprepared for the legal argument that Dolph had made. And the justice in that hearing, it seemed, was very frustrated with Health Canada's perceived lack of due diligence on reviewing the application and their lack of interest in engaging with the charter rights argument that Dolph has put forward in order to favor this application for the exemption. If the justice decides in favor of Dolph, one of two things can happen. The most likely thing is that Health Canada will be forced to reconsider their application under the court's direction. But it's also possible that Health Canada will just be forced to approve this application. And that could, in time, possibly set up a framework for more compassion clubs like Dolph, just in the way that a similar decision created a framework for supervised consumption sites all across Canada.
And meanwhile, I guess while we wait for that decision, Eris and Jeremy are waiting for their day in court?
Well, yeah, they've had the one day in court back in March with Health Canada, and now they are awaiting their criminal trial.
Is it just these two on trial, or is it the concept of safer supply in general?
I think this trial is a stand-in for the concept of safe supply. Earlier in Trudeau's government's term, they were more willing to fund safe supply pilots, more interested in seeing what possible benefits there would be to these prescribed pharmaceutical alternatives. But the funding for that looks like it's drying up. They seem uncommitted to whether they're going to continue with these trials. And I think it's safe to say it's because they're waiting to see where the political winds are going to go. Maybe they're waiting until after the election. And in BC, the NDP government, which was previously quite progressive when it came to harm reduction, they're starting to backpedal a fair bit. They became the first province in Canada to decriminalize small possessions of illicit drugs. Well, in the last few months, they actually recriminalized certain components of it. So, drugs can't be used in many public spaces as they were before, though they can still be used in private spaces. And people have argued that this specifically targets the most highest risk, vulnerable drug users, people who are experiencing, chronic homelessness.
So I know the idea of quote unquote diversion has been getting a lot of attention recently. What is it exactly? How does it play into the safe supply debate?
Yeah, diversion is the idea that safe supply, whether it is these pharmaceutical safe supply or whether it's something that is offered in the Compassion Club like Dolph's, would find its way onto the street, that users would sell their safe supply to drug dealers in the illicit market. And I think more than anything, the concern that those diverted supplies would find their way to new users, to novel users. And more than anything, there's been a lot of concern that they might find their ways to underage users, to adolescents. This has been a pretty big concern among politicians. Like in Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith has raised a lot of alarms about drugs being diverted, and there's currently no evidence that it's widespread. In fact, the RCMP in BC has come out and said that there is no evidence of widespread diversion. But still, the impact of diverted safe supply is debatable. When I was on the downtown east side and I was interviewing drug users, members of Dolph, many of them were also recipients of government safe supply. And they did admit to me that they would sometimes sell their Dilaudid that was prescribed to them to illegal drug dealers and then, use that money for whatever. Maybe it's to get the drugs that they actually wanted, fentanyl, or maybe it's for food, or maybe it's for, cell phone plans. There was a study recently in the JAMA Internal Medicine Journal that reported an increase in opioid overdose hospitalizations in BC, and it suggested that prescribed drug diversion was a major factor. However, there have been critics of that study who have pointed out that the authors of the study are assuming that all prescription medications were from safe supply when there's really no evidence that that was the source for them. And the fact is that in BC, very few people are actually receiving prescribed safe supply. Of the more than 100,000 British Columbians who are addicted to opioids or stimulants, only around 5% of them are receiving pharmaceutical alternatives. And this is in large part due to doctor hesitance. Many doctors, understandably, are uncomfortable prescribing powerful opioids to people who may, in fact, have been prescribed painkillers that may have been to blame for their dependency that they have now.
Omar, thank you for walking us through this. It's a complex story, but a really fascinating look inside the work that's being done on safer supply.
My pleasure. It's always great to be on the show, and thanks for bringing attention to this important story.
Omar Muallim writing in Maclean's. That was the big story. For more from us, including previous episodes on safe supply and the overdose crisis, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also let us know what you think of this episode, which I'm sure some of you have thoughts about, by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us 416-935-5935 and leaving a voicemail. The Big Story's in every single podcast player. You can ask for it on a smart speaker by telling it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.